So we save this for eternity. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you. This evening we have the pleasure, or I have the pleasure of hosting a roundtable with Professor Capobianco. I think you all know him, so there's no need for a long introduction. Richard and I talked about it a little bit, and he would start with presenting some thoughts on his own work and research, and then it's a Q&A for everybody who is here. If you'd like to ask Richard questions on his work concerning Heidegger, maybe reading of Heidegger, etc., you can feel free to do so. If you're familiar with the little hand that you can raise digitally on Zoom, it would be practical if you use it, so I can see you want to ask a question and we don't have to shout. If you can't find it, jumping up and down will also do the trick. Well, that you will want to have something to say. So Richard, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for accepting the invitation. And we're very much looking forward to this roundtable, as I call it. Please feel free.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alfred. I want to thank Alfred again for organizing the roundtable and for organizing so many other important seminars. And I thank Alfred for his scholarship as well. And it's really a pleasure to see you all. I didn't really know how many people would attend this, so I thought that perhaps there would be more people who were not familiar at all with my work. So the presentation I have may go over things that you're quite familiar with, but there'll be plenty of time, I think, for questions and for comments and discussion. So thank you for taking your Friday night or your Friday afternoon to listen to a few things. I thought that maybe what I would do is give a short list of what I consider to be the hallmarks of my own scholarship on Heidegger and how it might be different from the scholarship of others. So to begin, I would say the first point I'd like to make is that I have emphasized the primacy of the matter of being in Heidegger's thinking. And I thought just by way of summary, I would just read this so that we could get a good idea of what I'm talking about here. So as I read Heidegger, by Heidegger's own testimony, the core question of his lifetime of thinking was the question of being, the Seinsfrage. But we must take into account his well-known turn, die Kehre, in thinking after the publication of Being and Time, or more broadly after 1930. In the early work of the 1920s, Heidegger was clearly influenced by the transcendental phenomenological approach of his teacher, Husserl, in framing the question of being. Nevertheless, after Being and Time and into the 1930s, it became clear to Heidegger that he simply could not arrive at his core matter of being through this transcendental phenomenological positioning. On further consideration, the philosophical project of phenomenology was, in his view, but another enshrinement of the human subject as the measure of all that is, and therefore another version of the forgottenness of being, Seinsvergessenheit. So Heidegger abandoned the fundamental positioning of the phenomenological project, and not surprisingly, the very term phenomenology virtually vanished in the later Heidegger's vast output of lectures and writings from the 1930s to his death in 1976. So after being in time, Heidegger moved on in his thinking to experiment with a variety of new ways of addressing and expressing the matter of being. And in my view, the hallmark of the originality and creativity of his later thinking was that he named being in a multitude of different ways to make manifest the various features of being as time, as the unitary and unifying temporal emerging and unfolding process or way, what I have called in my scholarship the being way, whereby and wherein all beings come to be. And in my most recent book, I have a whole chapter on the manifold names of being. I think this is important, that all of these names for being that he puts into play are not identical, but in his turn of phrase, the same. I mean, there are nuances of difference, but we're talking about the same fundamental core matter of being that he was chiefly concerned with. So when Heidegger turned to this matter after being in time, he looked back especially to the earliest Greek thinkers, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Anaximander, in order to retrieve what he understood to be the earliest names for being. And so, physis, aletheia, the primordial logos, the hen, the one, zoe, cosmos, aperon, and so forth. But he also crafted his own terms of art, I would call them terms of art, to name being: the clearing, die Lichtung, Ereignis, es gibt, and of course, das Heilige, the holy. So throughout his career, he is ever, always trying to rename this core matter. And the core matter is the being question, the matter of being, that from the very beginning of his thinking, right, he says, from the time he read Brentano, was the impetus for his thinking, and the one matter that he wanted to come back to again and again and again. So that's the first point that gives a kind of summary of what I've been trying to say in all of my scholarship. The second point I would say is that I have a deep and abiding respect for all of the early Heidegger scholarship, both the continental scholarship and the English language scholarship. And of course, especially for my own teacher and mentor, Bill Richardson, Hans-Georg Gadamer, when I spoke with him when he came to the United States every year in Boston, but also a very lovely and wonderful man, Manfred Frings. Maybe some of you are familiar with Manfred's work, but he was the editor also of volumes 54 and 55 in the Gesamtausgabe, two volumes that I have loved my entire scholarly career, and I've written extensively on them. It's the Parmenides lectures and the Heraclitus lectures from the early 1940s. Two absolutely beautiful lecture courses that Heidegger gave. I think it's Heidegger at the height of his powers, and also Heidegger who tells us things that we don't find in some of his other published work. And I've tried to draw that out in my own work. But I guess the point is that I see myself as always building on this very fine early scholarship. And I am not sympathetic. I have very little sympathy for the more recent Heidegger scholarship that often claims that the early scholarship was mistaken, or they got it wrong, or that they missed the core matter. I think that that is a rather arrogant claim to make. In addition, sometimes we hear today that we have to start all over again with the Heidegger scholarship. We have to begin again because the earlier scholarship missed the point. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it is more a matter of building constructively on the early scholarship, some of which was masterful. The third point I'd make is that I believe I may, among scholars, highlight, because I am so fond of the later Heidegger, I have emphasized certain differences between the early Heidegger and the later Heidegger. And I take those differences very seriously. There are significant developments in his thinking, but this does not, I think, imperil the unity of Heidegger's thinking, but it is the case that there are significant developments in his thinking. Why wouldn't there be? He lived quite a long time, and there's a long lifetime of thinking that he's engaged in. So of course there's going to be changes and developments, and I've highlighted those. In fact, I was thinking just this morning in my first book, Engaging Heidegger, chapters 3 and 4, I think are signature chapters in that book because they trace, the first one, chapter 3, traces Heidegger's, what I call his turn toward home, the theme of homecoming in the later work, which we don't find in the early work or in Being in Time. And chapter 4, which is the chapter on Befindlichkeit, or affective moods, and that title is From Angst, which is the Grundstimmung in Being in Time, to astonishment and wonder in the later work. So those are the kinds of developments that I've traced very carefully and have paid great attention to the text on. And of course, there are both philosophical and existential implications to these developments in his thinking. The fourth point is that I deeply care about Heidegger's poetic philosophical language. There is no Heidegger without this poetic language. And I think we must be wary of efforts to ignore or overlook or set aside or restate his language into what some people call a conceptually clearer language. Also, as many of you know, at every opportunity, I also encourage us all to use our own language, to use our own voice, our own images, to express his fundamental insights. I think it's important that we are speaking in our own voices and in the voices of our own cultural traditions as well. The fifth point I would say is, and I've discussed this with several of you, with Eric, I think in particular, but I've made every effort to draw out, especially out of the later work, right? These spiritually uplifting themes and features in Heidegger's work, in Heidegger's thinking, and to highlight these because often they are eclipsed in the present age that appears to cling so tightly to a tragic vision of life. And I think that it is very important for us to consider what Heidegger means when he says that we need to learn to dwell in the presence of the unfathomable mystery of being. I mean, this is such a core component of the later thinking, but it is often overlooked because there are different concerns, especially in the postmodern world. The overriding concerns beginning in the late 20th century and into the 21st century with brokenness, with fracture, with fragmentation, with illness and malaise, and a basically tragic vision of life has been solidified. So I think that this part of my scholarship is a good counter to that. You may not agree with it, but I think it's a good counter to that aspect of the modern and especially the contemporary culture. The sixth point I would make is that throughout, I have always said that Heidegger is our guide, but not our master. So I don't think that we should be entirely beholden to the texts in the sense that we simply repeat the texts again and again and again. I think we have to think through them and bring them alive in a new way and in our own way. And I also think that it is a mistake to be too beholden to Heidegger's biography. Now, biography is important and can be illuminating, but it can also be very limiting. And we know how destructive it can be in the hands of some who want to dismiss Heidegger out of hand for certain biographical features or certain biographical episodes in Heidegger's life. And number 7, and I only have 8, so don't worry. I won't talk too long. But number 7, I think, is that I've also made a point of saying that Heidegger's core concerns are not absolutely unique. Some Heidegger scholars, I think, want to claim too much for Heidegger in terms of originality. You find this in some books on Heidegger, that Heidegger, no one has ever said what Heidegger has said, and no one can say it again. And Heidegger, well, it's true that Heidegger has an original language, and it's compelling, it's resonant, it's part of his genius. I think we should respect that. But I do think that many of his themes, and I've discussed this in our group here on Zoom, and I've discussed this in all of my other work, that many of the themes we can see as really quite ancient in many ways, and they have been sounded before in other ways and in other world cultures. Let's see, Bharadwaj, is he still with us here? Bharadwaj? Oh, there, yeah, yes. Bharadwaj has written a recent essay elucidating a Sufi poem, an Urdu Sufi poem. Is that right, Bharadwaj? It's a beautiful essay. And I think that's, yes, it is. And I think that's the way the scholarship should move, I think. It's enlightening in a very wonderful way, and yet he's using a Heideggerian lens to read this Sufi poem. And I've done the same, trying to read Walt Whitman in my American tradition, or Emerson, or Thoreau, or Wordsworth and Gerard Manley Hopkins in the English Romantic poetic tradition. And I think that this is an opportunity for all of us to do this kind of scholarship with Heidegger without being so overly preoccupied with claiming some kind of absolute uniqueness to Heidegger's basic insights, both philosophical and existential. And the last point I would make is that, and this probably has been maybe the most controversial, but I think that we as Heidegger scholars or students of Heidegger's work, I think we need to be very, very careful, very prudent, very thoughtful when we address the matter of metaphysics. We have to avoid the easy dismissiveness of the metaphysical tradition and of metaphysics. And we find this, I think, all too often in some of the Heidegger scholarship. And I say this because, if we talk to metaphysicians, and Jude Chua and I have discussed this at some great length. Jude is a wonderful student of Thomas Aquinas, and he brings such a thoughtfulness to a Heideggerian encounter with Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Aquinas with Heidegger. And we've gone back and forth and we talk about this. But I think this shows that we must not set up metaphysics as some kind of straw man that we enjoy thrashing all the time, because metaphysics, after all, has been the study of being, and this is what Heidegger is concerned about, being. Now, we know that Heidegger had a quarrel with metaphysics, but I think we have to ask ourselves, what kind of metaphysics, right? And I have suggested that Heidegger had a particular quarrel with a metaphysics of substance, say, for example, in Aristotle and also into Thomas, and that has been part of our discussion together with between Jude and me, or a metaphysics of subject, right, which has dominated modern philosophy, the modern philosophy of consciousness. So I think that it is quite right to say that Heidegger was very critical of certain kinds of metaphysics, but that does not rule out altogether the possibility that metaphysics may be very helpful in understanding some of the things that Heidegger has to say about being. And, I've suggested that, for example, the process philosophy, the process metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead might be of some help in understanding what Heidegger is trying to get at in talking about being. So my only caution then is that we need to know, but let me put it this way. What I learned from Heidegger, from Gadamer, was that Heidegger was steeped in the history of Western philosophy. And I don't think that we can be critical of metaphysics until we read Plato and Aristotle, until we read the Neoplatonists, Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, Iamblichus, until we read St. Augustine, Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, until we read Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa, until we read 20th century philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead, who was engaged in thinking metaphysically, but in a very, very different way from classical metaphysics or classical metaphysicians. the so-called metaphysicians of substance or of subject. So I think if we commit ourselves, and I'm speaking now just as a student of Heidegger's thinking and as a Heidegger scholar, if we commit ourselves to reading as much as Heidegger did in the history of Western philosophy, and by all means, I don't mean to exclude other world traditions, other world cultures and their philosophy, but Heidegger was clearly focused on the Western tradition. I think if we commit ourselves to deep learning, then we would not be as quickly dismissive of metaphysics, of the aims of metaphysics, or of the metaphysical tradition. We could have our quarrels, but I don't think we would be as unthinkingly dismissive as I find in some of the Heidegger scholarship today. And certainly when I go to conferences and I hear graduate students repeat merely the meme, I guess it's the meme that we've overcome metaphysics, or metaphysics is over, it's at an end. I cringe a little bit because that's too easy. It's too easy. And I think we need to wrestle with the problem further. So those are some of my thoughts on a Friday afternoon. And, I turn it back over to you, Alfred.
Well, thank you, Richard, for your very enlightening introduction. Manfred Frings was one of the people who was chosen by Heidegger himself to be an editor of a volume of the Gesamtausgabe.
He was such a sweet man and played the piano beautifully.
And he's also the editor of the Shaler.
Yes. Just a quick story about Manfred. The last thing he said to me before he passed away was, "Don't bother as much any longer with Heidegger, read Shaler."
Yeah. So. You didn't take his advice. Well, I think your last point about metaphysics, you can't simply do away with metaphysics. It's a part of the history of being.
Yes.
Physical tradition. You have to go through it if you want to. And in German, Heidegger uses the word Verwindung and no longer Überwindung as overcoming. In a sense, to pass through it, see its limitation. And that opens up the perspective of this other kind of thinking Heidegger is talking about, let's say, from the mid-30s on. But we don't want to make this a 1-2. So if anybody feels the need to address a question or has a comment, please raise a digital hand or your real hand, and we can get some order into it. Yes, Walter. You need to turn on your microphone. Otherwise, we can't hear you.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, for that, and thank you, Alfred, for having this. And Richard, your works have been very helpful to me, just immensely. I have a question, and I thought about it when I was reading one of your books as well, because I have an interest in phenomenology, and I want to go back to one of the first things that you said, and you really helped me clarify the separation between Heidegger and Husserl's phenomenology of consciousness and structure of consciousness and all that. I've always thought of Heidegger as taking a different route of phenomenology, and I've sort of continued to think of him as a phenomenologist, but in a different, because I took it in a different direction and really opened up phenomenology to mean something else. What is your feeling? Is it, in your estimation, can we call Heidegger, even the later Heidegger, a phenomenologist, or should we dismiss that? Should we separate Heidegger from the term phenomenology? Which do you think is more helpful and clearer.
Walter, thank you very much. It's nice to see you in person. I know we've had a few exchanges,
Yeah, thank you.
and I think that the difficulty with this term now is that once upon a time, phenomenology referred to the particular project of Husserl and his followers. But even in Husserl's own time, right, the character and the nature of phenomenology was much discussed and debated, and there were many disagreements within Husserl's circle. Ingarden and Fink, among others, thought that Husserl was truly a metaphysical idealist, that it was simply an idealism, and others thought not. But I suppose, to answer your question, once upon a time, when we used the word phenomenology, it referred very narrowly to the kind of phenomenological project, the transcendental reduction and the epoche that Husserl and students of Husserl, or those who practiced phenomenology in that way, were very familiar with. But over the decades, phenomenology has come to mean just about anything. I was listening to someone talking about the phenomenology of sailing, or or Jude is a big golfer, right? The phenomenology of golfing. So the term has come to mean, I think, just very generally, any experience that we have, any descriptive experience that we have of anything. Now, Husserl would be turning over in his grave to hear something like that. To him, phenomenology was a scientific enterprise, and it was meant to very carefully delineate the components of consciousness that were able to construct the noema. And we're way past that. And so when folks use phenomenology, the term phenomenology, it's almost impossible to know exactly what they mean by it. And yet, as you say, Walter, it's used by so many people. And I suppose if we want to say that the later Heidegger is a phenomenologist, if by that we mean Heidegger was concerned with giving an account of the human beings or human Dasein's experience of being, yeah, well, yes, okay. If we want to counter what is a kind of analytic philosophical approach that's logical and propositional and syllogistic, with a phenomenological approach that takes into consideration the experience of the human being, then I suppose that is perfectly okay. But I just don't think it tells us much. It doesn't say much because the word has come to mean just about anything that refers to a lived experience or a human lived experience of something, of anything. So for that reason, I myself avoid it in the same way that I think Heidegger avoided it, because it either was a reference to Husserl's project, which he abandoned, or he couldn't give or wasn't interested in giving a new definition to the word phenomenology. And so he just continued on his way in talking about the thinking of being.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. And I do take Heidegger in the way that you said, where it could be acceptable. But I have found, as you said, that once I do that and feel comfortable, I'm grasping at thin air. I don't really know what to do with it after that. So That's very helpful and kind of gives me a lot to think about. Thank you.
Good, good. Thank you, Walter.
Well, Achim?
Yes, thank you, Richard, for your presentation and your invitation to us to your thinking and understanding of Heidegger. Building on what you just said with respect to the term of terminology, phenomenology, can one say that Heidegger is to some extent also guilty of that kind of degradation of the term phenomenology, because it's unclear what his method of operation in his thinking is. See, the question that I often get asked is, how does Heidegger know that? Especially when trying to understand being in time, and how he comes about the existentials, and which he derives out of some kind of apprehension of our ontic reality, and he tries to come to some kind of what's the term he uses Verallgemeinerung, maybe a generalization in quotation marks, to refer to the a priori ontic how shall I say phenomena of human existence, human being, and to me, reading him in German, it really makes sense, and I can agree with him. But to explain the method of his thinking is another thing, and I think that's where one has to somehow come to some kind of clarity, because that's another problem. What people have with Heidegger, comparing the early with the later Heidegger, the earlier one is conceptually clear, as you said, and the later one is, if I say it in German, verklärt. And he uses the word Verklärung in his black notebooks. And in order to say that, I think once you want to approach the mystery of being, then you lose that kind of conceptual, logical, analytical clarity, and you have to allow some kind of Verklärung. I don't know what the word in English would be, maybe unclarity, and that's another problem that we have when we speak Heidegger, when we try to understand Heidegger in a different language, but German. But it's a good challenge, because then you're forced to explicate what you think you understood when you read Heidegger. And so you are forced to, as you said, we should engage in a poetic philosophy and form our own language. And it's a struggle. And we see how Heidegger struggles when I read now with our group, Alfred Denker's group, Being in Time, what kind of struggle it actually was when Heidegger composed Being in Time, and how rich the text is when you allow yourself the time to really read it as Heidegger composed it. And that is the struggle. So to appreciate his language and then understand it to the point that you can actually speak it in different languages, or say what he means in different languages. So back to the question of phenomenology, what do you think, if you had to describe his method, what is it?
Well, I wouldn't want to describe his method, because I don't think that he has a method. I mean, that whole language of methodology belongs to a very different kind of philosophical discourse. And so Achim, I agree with what you're saying about the later Heidegger. I mean, there's a richness there that we're working with, and that we're immersing ourselves in, and we're trying to express this in our own way. But I don't think that we need a methodology. Now, the danger. Now, it's quite clear, as you say, that some people gravitate toward the early Heidegger because they do find a kind of methodology there, or they find a certain conceptual clarity that they don't in the later work. But the danger with just limiting ourselves to the early Heidegger of Being in Time, let's say, is that this has been this analysis of consciousness has been almost entirely appropriated by analytic philosophy or philosophy of mind. And so I'm not sure of what the long-term benefit would be of exclusively focusing on the early Heidegger, because those concerns have been, again, almost entirely appropriated by analytic philosophy and conceptual analysis and philosophy of mind philosophers. So I fear that there's really not much there left in terms of thinking about Heidegger and the larger philosophical world. And of course, there's also the appropriation of Heidegger for pragmatic purposes, right? So in the Dreyfus school of thinking, his many students read the early Heidegger as a pragmatic philosopher, and there's some value in that, but that too has, I think, buried the genius of Heidegger's work, or the creativity of Heidegger's work, or the richness of Heidegger's work. So I think that we must continue to think through Heidegger, but without worrying about a methodology, because that's the language that I think concedes to the analytic tradition that there has to be a methodology in order for us to think philosophically or to think
yes,
thoughtfully.
So how do you then fend off charges of irrationality, that basically this is so unmethodological that it borders on irrationality, so that, and then you can just put Heidegger to the side and not worry about him anymore?
Well, I don't know what irrationality would mean. It may not be logical in the analytical sense, but it still could be reasonable and thoughtful and meaningful to human beings. I see no reason why we have to limit reasonableness to what is logically sound, or what is syllogistically amenable. I think that we would have to challenge that very assumption. It's clear that there's an audience for Heidegger that goes beyond the logical, that goes beyond the narrowly rational, that goes beyond this concern with strict argumentation. There's an audience, and therefore people are responding. There is those who are listening, and so I think we continue to speak to those who can appreciate that Heidegger without worrying about responding to those who would claim it's not strictly argumentative, or it's not logical in any strict sense of the term. I don't think there is an answer that would satisfy those folks.
Yes, I agree with you. I was curious how you would respond to these questions, also with respect, and that will be my last point. And then when you said his core question remains being, and throughout his philosophical life, and then he finds different names, words to speak to what I would call the reality of being. I don't know whether you would say that too, but being escaped, so being is, if I speak with Parmenides. But then and I only followed it not really closely, but when someone says, well, like Thomas Sheehan, and I only read reports that no one really knows what Heidegger means by being, and what we are doing is wasting our time trying to understand what being, his philosophy of being, because I almost get the sense that this is a futile endeavor, and one should go to focus on real things. Maybe you want to speak to that kind of controversy briefly, if it doesn't take up too much time.
No, I don't know what could possibly be the basis for such a sweeping generalization, like nobody knows what Heidegger's talking about when he's talking about being. Well, that's surely not the case, because, I mean, I've written 3 books on it. There's another one coming out next year. So many others have written about this concern that Heidegger has with being. So there are indications, there are signposts, there is a language we can use to talk about what Heidegger was concerned about. Now, if that is of no interest to some other scholars in the Heidegger field, that's not our problem. That's their problem. If they don't want to spend the time to think about what Heidegger is talking about in talking about the experience of being, that is not our problem as students of Heidegger's thought, or those of us who find it resonant and meaningful and attempt to express it in our own ways. So I reject outright this assumption, I would call it a kind of arrogance, that nobody knows what Heidegger's talking about when he's talking about being, so why bother with the question? I don't agree with that at all. And I would ask, what is the alternative? Is the alternative for some of these other folks to turn Heidegger into an analytic philosopher so that we can talk to the analytic philosophy crowd? Is that the aim? Well, if that's the aim, then Heidegger will certainly be eclipsed, because the analytic folks are not going to hold up Heidegger as one of their own. So I think that is a doomed project. If that is what the alternative is, that would be my answer, Aki.
Good, thank you very much.
Okay, we have 2 more people want to participate by asking a question or make a comment. So first Larry, and then Radway.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to, I've been thinking about the question of method, and I believe, especially in the later Heidegger, that he does put forward a method. It's not what people think of typically as method. It is simply, if being is presencing or unfolding, then we should stay with our own unfolding, stay on the path. And I refer you to a paper I have on my academia page called Attention as the Way to Being. Heidegger has a way to being, and the way is not to pay attention to the content of the course. I'm paraphrasing Heidegger right now. Don't pay attention, don't get lost in the content, stay with the path itself, the unfolding itself. And I would argue that is a phenomenological approach. It's being more present to my own very unfolding in the course of my living my life. Because that's how I relate to the larger unfolding. The larger, I am part of being, and I unfold it within being. So that is the way. It's a manifestation, and I would argue that is what phenomenology is about. Husserl and his techniques are, they're just intellectualisms as far as I'm concerned, really, epoche, reduction. I think it's just all about what Heidegger calls us to do, is stay on that path.
Larry, it's so great to see you. And Larry and I go way back, and Larry has a new book on attention, which I recommend to everyone. The only thing I would disagree with Larry is that, again, you could call it phenomenological, and this goes back to Walter's question. But as you describe this method, or as you describe phenomenology in later Heidegger, we could also say that that's true of Plato. And if we read Plato, Plato says stay true to the unfolding of the soul. and we move through different stages in the pursuit of beauty. Well, we find this in the Neoplatonists, we find this in Plotinus, we find this in Proclus, we find this in the Iamblichus, we find this in Saint Bonaventure, right? And Jude, we say we find it in Thomas Aquinas. So it's a path, but it's not uniquely phenomenological in that terminological sense, to say that Heidegger is doing this and therefore it's phenomenological. If it is phenomenological, then we can also find that in other great thinkers in the tradition. And if you want to call that phenomenological, fine with me. That's fine with me.
Yeah, I think that phenomenology just is mindfulness. Okay, so I think mindfulness is the actual process and I think it's in Plato. And I think about this question, and when he asked what is justice in the Republic, the one time it's addressed is mind your own business. I mean, that's I don't know what the Greek is, but I think that's a gesture toward this spiritual path too. Be present to your own life unfolding. So I would agree,
Yes.
and I got phenomenology. The essence of phenomenology is just that. And I'm arguing. In my book, I argue against the hobby. I spent 3 chapters arguing against the hobby. He argues that phenomenology is much more than mindfulness. I just think he's miles off, and Husserl practiced mindfulness too. When he yeah.
No, and that's why, coming back to my last point, I think that if we understand phenomenology in that broad and rich way that you're talking about, Larry, then we could say that metaphysical thinking is phenomenological. There's a meeting here of the two, because some of the great metaphysicians in the tradition were mindful in that way. They were not simply offering propositions. There's this caricature of metaphysics as textbook metaphysics, but Plato is very much alive to the human experience and the human situation, and to mindfulness, as you're saying. But so are the Neoplatonists, so are the great medieval metaphysicians. So I don't wish, I guess I put it this way. Let's call that phenomenological, sure, but let's not oppose it dramatically to metaphysical thinking then, because there is no necessary disjunction between those two, if that's how we're understanding phenomenology. Yeah.
And I would just throw in that Richard is part of a project now with Eric Kurofsky, is putting forward this book project where this is the hidden story of metaphysics right here. And I'm going to try to throw in an abstract myself for that project. So that's really what, according to what Eric is putting forward, is that's the essence of metaphysics. It's not mysticism in the way it's thought, but it's more this pure presencing or mindfulness approach.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. Thank you
Hello.
so much for Thank you for your presentation and for the summary of your major points through your work, the major thread of your thought. So I have a comment from your works, and then maybe a question following that. So this comment goes to the 7th point that you mentioned in your presentation today about Heidegger's uniqueness. Now, in your latest book, Heidegger's Being, the Shimmering Unfolding, you mention in the chapter on Rumi and Heidegger, which also incidentally happens to be the inspiration for the article that you mentioned. I mean, that chapter of yours on Rumi and Heidegger. In that chapter, you mention that this is on page 153. You say that Heidegger belongs to a long tradition of poets and thinkers who understood that the source of all human language and meaning is beyond all human language and meaning. And you also mention in that chapter that, this long tradition to which Heidegger belongs is across cultures as well, across languages and so on. Now, in the previous book of yours, in Heidegger's Way of Being, you present an interesting philosophical analysis of this point when you mention in page 46 about what is called the Greek experience of nature, phusis. And over there you mention a difficulty, and then you also present a sort of philosophical response to this. You say that what Heidegger calls the Greek experience could be thought in an ontological, structural sense, rather than what you call the ontic sense of a geographical, historical people. So to you, then, that becomes a means of thinking about Heidegger across cultures, as you have done in the recent text. So you claim that Heidegger can be read as claiming that this Greek experience is a structural phenomenon which can be found in thinkers and poets throughout the world. But what do we do with that textual limitation that you mentioned, that Heidegger speaks in a language which suggests as if this Greek experience is limited to a particular period of time and to a particular geographical sort of history? How do we deal with that? And could Heidegger's engagement with Zen Buddhism, for example, be a sort of textual means of thinking about how or a textual means of hoping that Heidegger could have thought about this Greek experience cross-culturally as well? Yeah, that would be like my set of comments and maybe the question. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question. And first of all, I thank you for reading my work so closely. I appreciate that very much. That's music to an author's ears. But I think you point out a very, very important point there. And I tried to deal with it a little bit in Heidegger's Way of Being, and you're quite right to point it out. I think that in Heidegger's narrative, in this grand narrative that he unfolds, he's so concerned with valorizing the Greek experience that sometimes it does appear that he is limiting this fundamental, this primordial insight into being to the Greeks, and more specifically to the pre-Socratic Greeks, to Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Anaximander, because he even sees in Plato and Aristotle a certain devolution of thinking away from the great awakening of thought among the pre-Socratics. So I would have to agree that there are passages in Heidegger that, if we understand his narrative, where he is valorizing the Greeks to the point where it seems that he is limiting the insight to the Greeks. However, there are other places where he seems to be more expansive in referring to the Greek experience. And by that, it does seem to be more of an ontological, as I said, an ontological feature of human Dasein, that we are that open to the experience of being, and that we can experience being in the ways in which Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Anaximander experienced that. And that, of course, would then release the Greek experience to be found in other cultures and in other periods of time. And that certainly is the way I would prefer to read the Greek experience, as you have, you have taken that very seriously, and you have found marvelous insights in reading that Sufi poem. So I think that that's probably something that a student of Heidegger would have to continue to wrestle with. But again, here I would say that sometimes Heidegger gets caught up in his own grand narrative, and he wants to make the case that the earliest Greeks did something fundamentally different from some of the later metaphysical thinkers, or all the later metaphysical thinkers. And so he overdoes the statement, I think. And that's something we need to be aware of. But Watch, thank you very much. That's a very, very, very good question. Very good question.
Thank you so much. If I could just add just one thing.
Yeah.
You also and thank you for that explanation. You also mentioned that one other way in which we can think about Heidegger's this Greek experience is to think of it as a foil or a counter to the modern sort of technologically inframed experience of nature, of being. So again, I think that again becomes that ontological, you even use the term archetype, I mean, as an exemplary sort of experience, which can work as a counter to our present situation or our present condition. Yeah, so
yes.
Okay,
and
thank you.
And to use, I mean, we still could use the language of the early Heidegger. We are an ontological unity. All human beings, right? Human Dasein is an ontological unity. So insofar as we are ontic and we confront our facticity, that is an important part of our existence, but we must not let facticity be a prison for us, where we're locked into unremitting finitude, and we can have no connection to this openness to being. And that's the ontological dimension that we are, this openness to being. So I think the task for us, as Heidegger leaves it, is that as an ontological unity, we must be able to think or experience ontologically without sacrificing our ontic lives, our facticity, the pain and suffering of our facticity. We don't want to eclipse that or fly beyond that. On the other hand, in our ontic lives, we don't want to foreclose the ontological. And that's the problem, perhaps, in the present age, is that we're so focused on our facticity, on the pain and suffering of facticity, but at the same time, we have foreclosed ourselves to the ontological. And that leaves us in a factical prison, and unhappiness and depression, anxiety, and all that follows. Miles is not here today, but the Dasein's analysis certainly has to deal with that ontic reality.
Thank you.
Well, next up is Elias.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really, I got really interested in what you said about Heidegger's positive vision of life, as opposed to what we perhaps have in modernist literature and perhaps thinking as well, is tragic disillusionment. So I was just curious if you could kind of develop those thoughts a little bit.
Yes, I think that, well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I'm just in the process of finishing the manuscript for the next book. My next book is going to be titled In Heidegger's Vineyard: Reflections and Mystical Vignettes. And that'll be out next year. And I think there's a lot of that there in that new book, but it's also in the other books as well, where I think that in the later Heidegger, right, we should not skip over, for example, the beautiful commentaries on Hölderlin that speak of homecoming, that speak about dwelling near the hearth, that speak to a certain joy in dwelling in relation to being, that also talk to a brightness and a light and an illumination. You know, this motif of light that is saturated in Heidegger's later thinking in particular. So I would say in this most recent book, there are a number of places where I talk about this. But as you point out, it's often eclipsed or overlooked or set aside because our scholarly, at least our academic preoccupations are so often about a broken world, a fractured world, a fragmented world, a tragic world. And I see this more and more at all colleges and universities, where that is the overriding theme of so many courses, even in philosophy. And this I consider to be something of another way of looking at things in the present world that could be uplifting and healing and hopeful for people. And I think it's in Heidegger. I do think it is there in the later Heidegger.
Yes, I do see it in your work so far, and I was happy that you're writing another book, and also that it's going to address these questions. For example, Whitman, as you've written on him as well, is something that I appreciate very much. I got interested in this because egotistical reasons, I guess, but I was also into this kind of disillusionment thing when I was writing my own stuff, and then I thought, why not turn it around and be positive instead? So my own project is about learning to live, basically, and I wanted to connect to you and also to Heidegger in that sense, and I was wondering if there is an existential dimension that could perhaps be connected to Heidegger's reading of the poets, for example. Do you think that this is a way forward in Heidegger scholarship?
Oh, I do. I am hopeful. I am very hopeful because, again, the response that I get from readers, the emails that I get from readers on just that topic, really fill me with some hope and confidence, because it's a message that people are responding to, and yet it is difficult for them to find it in the contemporary academic world. And I find students as well saying the same thing. So I do think there is much work to be done, and that there is an audience, and that it is an important dimension of Heidegger scholarship moving forward. I do. And well, and your own work, right? I mean, help me, is it Elias or Elias? Because we've corresponded for so many years, but I've never.
Here in Canada, it's Elias. In Sweden, it's Elias. So you can pick and choose.
Okay. Well, we've
But just for you,
corresponded
Al.
for so long, and he contributed a beautiful essay to the volume Heidegger and the Holy, and you know the literature better than just about anybody, and you're working on the literature, and I'm delighted to hear that those are the themes that you're hoping to sound more and more, and with Heidegger's help. That's marvelous.
Yeah, thank you. And with yours, you're a great mentor.
Thank you.
Well, we go back to Achim.
Yes, maybe connected with what you have just been discussing. When you said that you find Heidegger spiritually enriching, I wonder whether you think today Heidegger's place is more in religion than in philosophy. So spiritually enriching, uplifting, meaning that there is a dimension Heidegger speaks about of human reality that is forgotten, and maybe that's the dimension of being that some, as you said, unites humanity despite our ontic differences, and that so Heidegger basically contributes to this kind of discovery of a common dimension that is maybe that of being, and whether this is something that that analytical philosophy maybe finds awkward because it's difficult to wrap their minds around. So being cannot be grasped exhaustively. It needs to remain open, an open mystery. So, and one needs to be satisfied with it and content with it, maybe, and that is the source of inspiration. But is that not the place of, is its place then not rather religion than philosophy, depending on how one defines philosophy today?
Yeah, well, Hakeem, I think that's a very important question. And to go back earlier, right, I think that there are clearly certain philosophical trends in the modern and contemporary academy that are completely closed to this dimension in Heidegger. Analytic philosophy is simply not interested in it. I mean, they're interested in conceptual analysis, or they're interested in philosophy of mind. And as I said, if the goal is to somehow turn Heidegger into a philosopher of mind, Heidegger is lost because they don't need Heidegger. They've got plenty of thinkers that they can turn to talk about that. Then there are other philosophical trends that, as we have said, are so preoccupied with social and political issues and with the brokenness and tragic suffering of the world that those particular ways of philosophizing are also closed to this openness to being, or to what we're calling this spiritual openness to the experience of being. So it is an uphill task, but it is a task nonetheless, because what I have found is that Heidegger has a natural home, not just in certain religious circles, but he has a natural home in poetic circles. I hear from poets all the time who are reading my work on Heidegger, and they're saying, this is the Heidegger that has inspired me now. Or from literary circles, novelists who say, this is the Heidegger I've not come across before, and I'm inspired by it. Artistic circles, painters, I hear from painters, I hear from sculptors. So the Heidegger we're talking about today does have a natural home in other places, perhaps. Now, it may be somewhat regrettable that it's not in some of the mainstream philosophy departments, but I don't think that's reason for despair, because there is a large audience, and there is a natural home for this kind of thinking, even if it is not, the analytic departments, analytic philosophy departments, or the philosophy departments that now have become preoccupied with primarily social, cultural, and political issues, because Heidegger doesn't have much to say to them either, right? And there is an assumption that we are to be entirely foreclosed to any other dimension of existence, that the only focus, what I call a hyperhumanism, the only focus is on how human beings exist and how human beings have to solve the problems of the world. You're not going to fit the later Heidegger in that context.
But thank you, Richard.
Oh, Jude,
Hi, Richard. Very happy to see you here.
You bet.
And thank you for your address. And I also wanted to thank Alfred for hosting this. Just a remark, not so much a question, might speak to some of Joachim's thoughts. It's just my own interest in Heidegger was really helped by Richard's clear writing and explanation of being, and especially the theme of how being sort of shows itself to us, and coming from a kind of scholastic stroke analytic tradition, I thought that was very, very interesting and really fascinating, because within my tradition, we are also struggling with getting around some of the problems Descartes bequeathed us. And recently, I just had a chance to reread some of Richard's works. And the other point that struck me again was not merely that being shows itself to us, but it's sort of abounds with significance. And so when we are engaged by being, we experience a kind of comportment that really considers what matters. And thank you for all of that, Richard. And I'm really looking forward to your new book on mysticism. I said once that I look forward to Richard's writing like people who line up to wait for the new iPhone. And I think, yeah, so looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Jude. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Oh, Alejandra, you have a question?
Yes.
Hi. Hello, Professor Richard. I have a question. Yes, I'm a student advanced. So my question is, I work with death, so in Heidegger's work. So I wrote my question. And thank you for this.
Yes, I'm sorry, you work with what, Alejandra?
With death, Sein zum Tode, being toward death. So I was thinking when I was hearing what you were saying about healing, is that okay? You listen, right? Is okay?
I can hear you.
Thank you. So I wrote my question. Is there a possibility that this idea or concept of being toward death, of being in time, that has been so beaten by Levinas or Ricoeur to think about the history when they say it doesn't work for thinking history, could be thought in a way of healing or a construction, as I interpret it, as a nice way to talk about it in being in time. Can we think of a philosophy of finitude as a prerogative that not leading, that not lead us to religion necessarily, but help us to construct our reality or think of our reality in a constructive way? I mean, the place of death is always a place of a difficult place to talk about, and it seems for what I've been reading and working, especially with Ricoeur, that is I think it's mistaken. But well, that was my question. Thank you very much.
Alejandra, thank you so much. Let me see if I can answer it this way, because I think that, the later Heidegger it gives us a different understanding or a different appreciation of death. And admittedly, in Being in Time, it appears to be. Where are you now? I was just looking at you, Alejandro.
I'm here.
Okay, yeah. So yeah. Oh my goodness. There is a certain. I don't want to use the word negativity, but it is certainly a difficult aspect of our existence in the early work in Being in Time. But I think the key turn here, Alejandra, is to releasement, to Gelassenheit in the later work. And there, death takes on a different aspect. So, for example, I was writing in Heidegger's Way of Being about this a little bit, and and I note that in addition to Gelassenheit, Heidegger often plays on the German word Leicht, and we have the same play in English. Leicht in German can mean light, as in illumination, but it can also mean a freeing up as well. And we have this in English as well. We could say, light, we come into the light, we come into the brightness, but we could also say to someone, we have to lighten your load. We have to release you from the difficulty and the pain of the burden. So I talk a little bit about that play he often makes on the German term. In fact, he was very fond of this expression, den Anker lichten, to lift the anchor off of the ground of the seafloor in order to allow us to release ourselves to the open expanse of the sea. He often uses that phrase to make that point. So, and I'm going to answer your question here. I think that in the later Heidegger, then, he has moved away from any kind of tragic vision or heroic tragic vision about death. And death, or our mortality, we see differently. So not any longer tragic in itself, not evil or absurd, not a great enemy that must be overcome, conquered, or defied. You think of Camus and this defiance against death, but rather here in the later work, to embrace the being way. That's my term, to embrace the being way is to embrace that we, like all beings, arrive, linger, and depart, right? And this is what Jude was referring to. This, we can describe what Heidegger is talking about by being or the being way. Maybe not ways in which, the analytic philosophers would like. We can describe it and understand it. So I say that we come to pass and we pass away, and the joy is in our passing this way at all. So I think that Heidegger's thinking of being continues to challenge us to see our way of being in a new light and to take it up with a new lightness. And I don't think the task is just philosophical. I think it is existential as well, right? We're revisioning ourselves, our relations, and even our mortality in accordance with the being way. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, it helps.
Yes.
I was looking for a points of view about death, because I will continue working. Now I'm focusing on Being in Time, but I will still be working after I graduate. So it works a lot for me.
Well, good. Thank you. And please feel free to contact me anytime to talk further. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Alejandra. Well, I think
Thank
we
you,
can.
Alfred, for this. Thank you for this space. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I think we can close it for today. Thanks again for all of you who have been present, to those who have asked questions and had an interesting discussion with Richard. And of course, most of all, Richard, thank you for taking the time to spend this hour and a half with us. We'll be in touch again and we'll see each other again, I'm sure.
Yes, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. So, and if you have any further questions, always feel free to contact me at my Stonehill address. I love the dialogue. I love it.
Okay, then I wish everybody a happy weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good
Thank
luck with
you.
all your different
Thank you
projects
very
in
much.
Heidegger.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Tschüss, tschüss.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.